Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Today I've come to address an urgent global problem that's been swept under the rug for more than 40 years. Global warming and climate change started from early as the 1830s, near the end of the Industrial Revolution. The global temperature increases by 0.8 Celsius per decade and has more than doubled to 0.18 Celsius since 1981. The world has currently warmed up by 1.2 Celsius and is set to hit 1.5 Celsius in 2030. That is only 7 years from now, and is on a course to hit 4.8 Celsius in the next 100 years. But what are we getting heated up for? What does this mean for you and me, the average person? 85% of the world will be affected, and at least 10,967 species will be endangered. More unpredictable weather patterns, droughts ruining crops, and a handful of other problems and issues from global warming. Our favorite fruits, vegetables, and animals might not exist in the next 50 years. Your children will not be able to experience the animals like the African and Asian elephants, polar bears, great pandas, tigers, and cheetahs. Fruits like coffee, chocolate, honey, avocados, wine, seafood, and strawberries, and bananas are at risk of extinction due to the increased temperatures. Now let's take a dive into the oceans. The reason that the world-damaging climate change was not detected earlier is because of the vast oceans was masking the climate temperature change. Now let's take a dive into the oceans. The reason that the world-damaging climate change was not detected earlier is because of the vast oceans was masking the climate change. The ocean absorbs a critical 93% of global warming. The melting of the ice caps is causing rising oceans and seas, and at least 80 million now let's take a dive into the oceans. The reason that the world-damaging climate change was not detected earlier is because of the vast ocean was masking the temperature change. The ocean absorbs a critical 93% of global warming. The melting of our ice caps is causing rising oceans and seas, and at least 800 million people will be affected in one way or another. The Great Barrier Reef is one of the great wonders of the natural world and is the biggest coral reef in the world. The Great Barrier Reef is on a crash course to be completely gone by 2050. The coral reef racks in $6.4 billion, about $20 per person in the U.S. Each year, it creates 64,000 full-time jobs. The reef is an essential part of the tourist industry. Each year, it creates 64,000 full-time jobs. Each year, it creates 64,000 full-time jobs. Each year, it creates 64,000 full-time jobs. The reef is an essential part of Australia's tourism industry. Christy Campbell states the colossal Great Barrier Reef that we see today has been building for 20,000 years. The disappearance of coral reefs from our planet can lead to a domino effect of mass destruction. Many marine species will vanish after the only source of food disappears forever. Climate change is reversible only if we try. You've probably seen a video online about climate change and gotten motivated for a few seconds. But what do you do after that? You scroll to the next video and forget about it. You lose all that sense of motivation. Motivation does not come before action. Action comes before motivation. In the early 1980s, there was a new phenomenon called In the early 1980s, there was a new phenomenon that created a hole in the ozone layer. A global agreement was made to stop producing the chemicals that causes the ozone hole. In the early 1980s, there was a new phenomenon called In the early 1980s, there was a new phenomenon. In the early 1980s, there was a new phenomenon that created a hole in the ozone layer. A global agreement was made to stop producing the chemicals that causes the ozone hole. In recent years, the hole has been decreasing in size as a result of the global agreement. Climate change can be stopped if only. In the early 1980s, there was a new. In the early 1980s, there was a new phenomenon that created a. In the early 1980s, there was a new phenomenon called. In the early 1980s, there was a new phenomenon that created a hole in the ozone layer. A global agreement was made to stop producing the chemicals that causes the ozone hole. And in the recent year, it has been decreasing in size as a result of the global agreement. Climate change can be stopped if we do something about it. Just like the ozone hole, if the whole world comes to an agreement, we can stop global warming.